In Alaska, 80% of our tax base is exempt in a lot of ways, whether it's land or federal, state, local, like there's so many ways that we have a very limited tax base to work with, which means the taxes that people are experiencing feel like a lot more. They're bearing more of the brunt. A lot of folks are still used to the state paying for things, and we really haven't turned the corner from the state being in a position to do that. So I think that local governments pick up a lot of what the state used to, and residents don't know that or don't see that. And what happens is like local governments have mitigated kind of the consequences of state decision making so that residents don't see it as much, and residents still have the same expectations. So I think we need to talk more about here's how the state decisions are impacting local taxpayers.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is the Executive Director of the Alaska Municipal League, Nils Andreassen. The Alaska Municipal League is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, statewide membership organization of 165 cities, boroughs, and unified municipalities, representing over 97% of Alaska's residents. Originally organized in 1950, the League of Alaskan Cities became the Alaska Municipal League in 1962 when boroughs joined the league. Nils grew up in Washington State, got a degree in Peace and Development Studies from the University of Bradford in Great Britain, and was the executive director of the Institute of the North prior to moving to AML in 2018. Nils Andreassen, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Where were you born?
California. Yeah, both of those words attached to each other.
That's how I think about it. Did you grow up in California?
No, just a couple years, like in the mountains north of LA or something like that, north of Orange County. And then moved to Washington, I think, when I was 2 or 3 or something like that.
So did you grow up in Washington?
Grew up in Washington State, little town of Graham, which is probably less little now, outside of Puyallup.
Tell us about your childhood. What was it like?
Bucolic? I don't know. Riding bikes around the neighborhood. I was a newspaper boy. Forts and woods kind of stuff. I mostly think about elementary schools growing up, and then there were more formative years after that, I'm sure.
What did your parents do?
My dad's a school psychologist. My mom's a school counselor. She was a special ed teacher when I was growing up. So I'm very self-aware of all the things. And I'm really interested in people dynamics often and thinking about what else is going on. I like that about having grown up with parents like that.
Did they work in the school that you went to?
No, my dad was more on the administrative side, like for the district-wide school psychologist. And then my mom was always in different schools.
And you graduated from high school in that bucolic community?
It was less bucolic at that point. I moved to Puyallup at some point, and Puyallup at this point is, I don't know, larger, and there was a lot of growth since then. That was very different. It was fast moving and real, like Graham was rural in a lot of ways, really adjacent to wilderness and some farms and so on. And Puyallup felt, I would say, more like a difference between affluence and poverty. And I experienced that very differently than I probably did earlier in life.
What year did you graduate from high school?
95.
And did you go straight to college?
No. I always thought I would. I had grand visions of college life. It turns out I should have been saving for college along. Anyways.
Did you expect your parents to pay for it?
There was maybe some misunderstandings between which parent was supposed to be doing what, and maybe some assumptions.
Divorced?
No. Just hadn't talked about that, and so I think that's my understanding of how things happen. It's like I was something of a letdown, but I went right into the workforce. I've been working in kitchens throughout high school, pizza places and whatnot, and so moved right from high school into prep work and so on, and ended up managing different restaurants and
in
Puyallup, Tacoma. Like I stepped into some of the Tacoma space and managed some brew pubs and kitchens there. And so I was a chef for a large portion of my early adulthood. First jobs in Anchorage were Moose's Tooth and Snow City.
What happened after those were your first jobs? You were working in restaurants, and then what happened? Did you move to Anchorage and continue doing that work?
No, I Where is this all going? You just want to know.
You're not familiar with my podcast.
I'm not, no. So I had a friend who was a dishwasher. This is my story. I have a friend who was a dishwasher. He was an anarchist and introduced me to thinking beyond like the work that I was doing, and not in one direction or another, but just that there were like other issues out there that I should be paying attention to, what was going on in the state and going on in the nation, going on in the world. And I wanted to do and know more. And my parents were working at international schools at the time. And I was like, I'm going to move to Africa. And so I lived with my parents at some point. And so I moved to Africa for a year. And that was me like discovering like what I hadn't really.
What'd you do in Africa?
Tutored students. Actually, like I did cooking lessons for house staff.
Where did you go?
Nairobi. So yeah, I moved to Kenya for a year. Nairobi is where they were. I worked in Diani Beach.
So your parents were working in international schools, like teaching English?
Yeah. All the expat kids just have regular school there.
Oh, got it.
So moved to Africa. I was there for a year, applied, and decided I liked wanting to solve issues for people. I liked kind of thinking about third world challenges and some of the challenges that I was seeing around me during that time. I applied for schools in England while I was there and got accepted to the University of Bradford. So I went from Africa to, I think I like made a stop here, and then I went to school at the University of Bradford, 3-year programs. I actually did a semester abroad at UAA, which is
That's so funny.
fun, and it's fun to see.
So you're like a British foreign exchange student?
Basically, yeah. I got credit for it and got a bachelor's degree in peace and development studies. And they're one of the few schools out there that really have that combination.
What is peace studies?
A lot. So it's not like necessarily the opposite of war studies. It's really, I would say it's like thinking about things in terms of social determinants of health, community building, community development, conflict resolution was a big part of our coursework, economic theory, public administration, the role of governance and good governance. I spent a lot of my time thinking about regional collaboration, and in Africa, I think it's South Africa Development Coalition or something like that. But basically, yeah, how do countries work together to solve challenges that they're experiencing? Understanding the role of religion in peace and conflict, and all the different variables that kind of build up the fabric of community and society.
In general, somebody who gets a degree in that, what's their job?
I would say that most people go into international affairs, so State Department would be the
most natural
equivalent, yeah, or USAID, those kinds of a non-governmental program would be natural. But I moved back and forth to Alaska at that point, and had moved to Alaska.
Well, why were you back and forth to Alaska?
Yeah, so I knew somebody from Tacoma, a girl from Tacoma was from Anchorage, and so we got married, had a baby, and so family, ultimately, she's from here. So I moved here. And there's a lot of things that I was thinking about in terms of international development that were just as
applicable,
relevant in Alaska. So I think it was like summer jobs were Snow City and Moose's Tooth. And then once I'd graduated, I started working for Rural Cap as my first maybe real professional position.
Using your degree.
Yeah.
Hey, bouncing back, your name, Nils Andreassen, where'd that name come from?
It's Nordic, Norwegian, but a number of generations back. It's not recent at all. I think my Norwegian ancestors actually ended up in Oregon as like in a farming community, but maybe they were chaplains or there was a religious component to the role that they played there.
But you didn't grow up speaking Norwegian or had Norwegian speaking relatives?
No, I feel bad about it. But I've spent enough time in Nordic countries that it still resonates, whatever connections we have to place and past. Yeah, but also there's a lot of familiarity between Alaska and the Nordic region. So it felt home in a lot of ways.
Got your first real job at Rural Cap.
Yeah.
And then what happened?
I don't know. I mean, I think that I discovered that Alaska really was a place where if you were interested in something, you could do anything. Like it's raise your hand and jump in. So I taught at UAA first year after my degree as an adjunct and actually did a couple semesters doing that. That was enjoyable, but way beyond my, shouldn't have.
Such an Alaska thing. But what were you teaching?
Political economy, I think, and public policy. I worked on various gubernatorial campaigns.
What was the first gubernatorial campaign you worked on?
I think I worked for Ethan. It was early in his
Political life.
Yeah, but that was interesting and became more aware of some of the kind of state politics that were out there. I think I volunteered or was a fellow at the Institute of the North at the same time also that I was at Rural Cap, and ended up moving from Rural Cap to Institute of the North as a staff person next. And that grounded me in, a Hickle vision of owner state. And I was just talking with somebody last night. I saw Meade Treadwell, and I've always thought of Hickle's lieutenants, Malcolm Roberts and Meade Treadwell, as two sides of a coin, but very consistent in thinking about the owner state, but different.
Well, explain what the owner state means to you.
I don't think I ever told Meade or Malcolm how much they meant to me in helping me think about Alaska's role in the Arctic or in the nation or the role of the state. I think there's a lot to the owner state. For me, it was about really, what can you do with land and resources to advance and improve the condition of communities? Really tying those two things together. And the stewardship that's involved. I spent a number of years in that position, working through the conflict that also arises. I'm an owner, and right? But there's responsibilities that come with ownership. And I think that's what mattered to me. So from having just done peace and development, an owner state model meant for me, is this a way for us to improve as Alaskans? Can we change our trajectory and invest differently in our people and communities? So I think I saw in that a lot of promise, potential. I hosted the Alaska Dialogue for a lot of years, which is a convening of leaders from across the state and different perspectives. And we're hearing a lot from our Ghosts of Alaska, past Clemtillion and Jack Roderick, and just lots of a diverse group of old men.
So Clemtillion was the president of the Senate in 1980.
Yeah.
Jack Roderick was the last mayor of the borough of Anchorage.
And Vic Fisher and so many others that have had a historic role in Alaska. And that history was very important to them. And we also spent a lot of time during those years thinking about the next generation. And so I got really involved in emerging leaders types of programs and made up a bunch of them. And it's fun today, a decade or so later, to see a lot of those emerging leaders emerged and we're living the positions that we were aspiring to back then. And whether I'm a leader or not, and I feel like I've got a leadership role. But back when we were talking about emerging leaders, it felt like there was a ceiling, right? There wasn't necessarily a direct line to having a voice in where we were headed as a state. And so we created, in my mind, parallel paths to being leaders in our community, however we wanted to be. And that's where we grew and cultivated some of those skills. And that's where we got to work our way into positions that we have today.
You worked your way into being the executive director of the
Alaska Municipal League.
Yeah, AML.
Yeah.
Alaska Municipal League.
First, I was the director of the Institute of the North for 10 years, I think. And it was all there was the Alaska, the owner state piece, but there was also the connection to the Arctic.
And so when you say the owner state piece, you mean the fact that the state owns the subsurface rights and then we collect that money and then we use it for the good of the state?
I think that's the basic piece. And there was always more to it, either in Hickle's writings or even going back to the Constitution. And one of my favorite pieces of the Constitution is the fact that we have not just rights, but responsibilities too. And I think that's part of that ownership. It's not just ownership. There's a responsibility and obligations that come with it. But we found that same sentiment in other Arctic nations who resource rich. There's nothing different necessarily about Alaska when it comes to resources. All the Arctic states have some level of resourcing, different, but Like they've each maximized the benefit in just different ways. So we did a Norway policy tour, Iceland, Finland, and we took legislators to all those countries, learned a lot about sovereign wealth funds and
It's
other
funny you used to live
tools.
in Finland. I mean, like, it's not like Norway. They had Nokia was like their big industry. They were like tech.
Right.
And then timber had been like before that because they didn't have oil.
Yeah. So each country had a different lesson for us. I think that where we focused in Finland was you had Sami relationships that the
Like
government,
the indigenous people.
yeah,
Finland.
Finland, and how important that was. You had
Although that's interesting because they're like the far north indigenous people, but the Finnish people have been there for 10,000 years. They're
Yeah.
all indigenous, but
right, and the Sami are recognized within the Arctic Council, and so there's those connections. But
and
I
the
mean, as soon as-
Sami spans multiple countries' borders.
yeah. So I think Finland participates as a nation state. They get to do that differently and separately. We looked at technology, we looked at icebreaker development, we looked at education models, and each country you can learn something from, not to do just what they did, but look for lessons, like what would work here, what wouldn't. They were cool. It was nice to see a sauna in the Department of Education in Finland, and saunas everywhere. Part of the Finnish model, and maybe Nordic more broadly, is when you bring the bar up far enough, and not to equalize, but to invest, bring people out of poverty enough that they're all participating actively within the economy and contributing to workforce. And that's like one of the big lessons from Finland. We just make sure that nobody's living in poverty.
But they also don't have the super duper wealthy.
Yeah, there's still the opportunity to get to wealth. It's just different, and the extremes are different, right?
You can make 20 times more than your lowest paid worker, not 276 times
Yeah.
more than your lowest paid worker.
Yeah. And I can say all of that without commenting on how America does it. All very interesting about all these other countries who do it different ways. But Institute of the North, like that was a lot of Arctic. And like during that time, I helped put together an Arctic Mayors Roundtable. And I don't know that I got tired of like international Arctic politics, but it just kept coming back to the people doing the work in the Arctic were community leaders. So I ended up really wanting to spend time with them, and like the moving to Alaska Municipal League like was just a huge opportunity and to connect me and bring me a little bit closer to where people are really trying to solve things for residents. It didn't feel as abstract maybe, and that was really appealing. But not that everybody else isn't doing good work, and Institute of the North continues to do good work, but it was just a different level of leadership that I wanted to be involved with.
How did the position for the Alaska Municipal League come to your attention?
Late? Is that an option? I applied late. I knew the prior director, Kathy Wasserman, for a long time. AML had participated in Institute of the North events. And I reached out. I remember, I think I was running a strategic planning session in Kotzebue when I had an interview over Zoom or whatever with the AML board. And I didn't know a lot about the organization. I didn't have grand plans for how it would change or anything. I was like, here's what's important to me. And that resonated with the board.
And what year was that?
2018, I think. I think I'm going into my 8th year.
For folks who don't know what the Alaska Municipal League is, what is it?
There's lots of things. 75 years old, and we're celebrating our 75th anniversary. I think that's important that we predate statehood. But it's local governments who came together and said, listen, we need to work together in common cause for each other, with each other, and we need an organization to identify best practices, help us learn about what everybody else is doing, advocate at the state and national and federal level. And that's what AML does today. We're designed as a mutual beneficial corporation. We're a nonprofit that provides governmental services. We're different than many other nonprofits in Alaska. For most of our history, I would say that we were defined by two legs of a stool: advocacy, lobbying, especially at the state level, representing municipal interests there, and hosting our annual conferences where members come together and learn and share. More recently, a bigger leg than those two has been all the services that we're providing. And I think it comes at this point in time where, as the state is able to do less, as the federal government is uncertain. Local governments are expected to do more, and they need an organization that's able to stand alongside them and support them. So we augment capacity where we can and provide a range of services so that they don't have to on their own.
Do other states have their equivalent of an AML?
Yeah, almost every other state has a county association and a municipal league. Alaska's, I think, one of two where it's combined. So we're working with both cities and boroughs being the county equivalent in Alaska. And we belong to National Association of Counties and National League of Cities. They cover a lot of things for us on the national level. There are advocates in DC. I connect with my colleagues in other states, and I think that's fascinating to see how much there is in common with other states and what kind of pressures they're under and what's in common, what's different. And there's big differences between how states treat local governments and elsewhere and what that looks like here in Alaska.
So 2 questions. The first is, if there's like clearly different interests because they're different cities. Say, for example, a city that has very low property taxes versus a city that has very high property taxes. And I think we see that disparity a lot in Alaska. I feel like anything to do with property taxes is going to cause conflict because you have, I don't know, Soldotna with a very low property tax versus Anchorage with a very high property tax. And I guess, how do you navigate having both of those municipalities as entities and having very different opinions about property taxes?
Yeah. I mentioned that when I interviewed for the position, I didn't know a lot about AML or how local government in Alaska worked. And it was a joy of discovery and learning just how different local governments are. And I remember the first presentation I gave to AML members at my first annual conference really focused on, hey guys, you're all different. And here's what that difference means. There are communities who have jails. There are communities who have police departments. There's communities who have education obligations. For even the things that are the same between local governments, things like everybody receives community assistance. It means something different to different local governments. It could be 80% of a budget. It could be 0.001% of a budget. So speaking with a unified voice is really challenging in that environment. I think the way that we navigate through that is just recognizing that, yes, we're all different, that we've got like different issues that we need to tackle as a statewide member-based organization. And those things are important because they're important to different groups of our members. There's core principles that unite everybody, principles of protecting local decision-making, that ultimately, like, the closer to the people a decision is made, the better. And a principle of, we don't use this, but and that kind of corresponds to a principle of subsidiarity, which says that, but adds like the level of government that's also got the resources to do something about it, which isn't all local governments. So like knowing when it should be local and state, I think, is important.
Do you ever tell a municipality, I guess you have a board, correct?
Yeah.
And I guess that's the governing body. There's a lot of conflict between municipalities in our state. And I'm curious about if you just stay out of some of that conflict, or do you ever intervene and say, hey, this isn't really your issue?
No. I do what my board says and I do what my members say. I think we have to have really clear line, like AML doesn't tell members what to do. Like we can present lots of things, like here's for your consideration, here's best practices. All of those things, we can do research, we can bring all of those aspects together. But ultimately, like the relationship that local governments have with their residents and with other governments is theirs. Yeah. And we don't want to get between those. I think our role can be as a convener to consolidate perspectives, to build coalitions around issues that's important to all of them. But we don't want to interfere. It goes back, like the principle of local decision making means that AML is not making that decision for you. And we just support.
It's like every municipal entity a member of AML in Alaska?
I think so. We treat them that way. I think there are dues paying members and there are non-dues paying members. I mean, there are communities from that membership fee.
Are villages members?
It has to be an incorporated city. So if it's unincorporated, then no. They can be associate members and still benefit from a lot of the different things, but they wouldn't be voting on things like resolutions or.
In terms of whether you're an incorporated city or not, since I represent Anchorage, everything's Anchorage, we're clearly incorporated. But is there a number? Do you have to be a certain size to incorporate?
I think you do. It's in Title 29, and I'm not going to get it right probably. But for communities that haven't incorporated, one, they might have a tribal government that's already doing maybe a lot of the things in the community. And so they would see a city government as conflicting with that. There might be a lands conflict, or we don't want a city to have lands that is somebody else's otherwise. I think there's like that, which still leaves the state responsible for those communities, especially in the unorganized borough. There's another group of communities where city government, for them, I think it means taxes. So very tax averse, which means that the state is somebody else's taxes are paying for those things. So I think that's how it really breaks down, the incorporated city, and then like the organized borough versus unorganized borough plays out a little bit the same kind of dynamic, but just at a different scale and different implications.
I'm asking like leading questions up to Typhoon Halong and communities that were affected if they were members of AML. To me, that seems like that would be where it would differ from the lower 48, like with Kipnik and Kwagilungok, like basically going underwater and having a history of Newtok and other places falling into the water. That's something that these organizations in the lower 48 wouldn't be dealing with.
Yeah. So most of those communities have tribes and not cities. We do have members that were impacted, and we were focused on our job is an emergency response. We're not part of recovery efforts. But we offer to all of those communities basically like, what can we do to support your continuity of operations? Let you focus on recovery and response. Can we host your city council meeting? How do we make sure you file your state reports? What do your financials look like? So what can we do on that side? That's more our wheelhouse.
Interestingly, I'll just say I had a constituent who reached out to me right after Typhoon Halong and the evacuations of the folks at Anchorage. And he was like, hey, do they have an election coming up? What are they going to do? Asking all of these questions. And I was like, I didn't know any of those answers.
That's a good question.
And especially like when you think about like when the whole government itself has evacuated and is like on a gym floor.
Yeah. I'd love to offer the hot wash that occurs post-disaster. Hey, probably we should be talking about that, because I don't know that is on a checklist somewhere. Like, how do we keep government open while you're still responding? Luckily, they should have been through elections by then.
Yeah, they were.
Yeah.
I Googled it, and so I reassured that constituent that they were already done with their elections.
Yeah. But we've offered grant writing support. We can help those local governments support some of the FEMA connections and applications and so on. So we can offer that level of support. For the communities where there's a tribal government, we have less direct connection, but we had helped the Kipnuk write their hazard mitigation plan. So there's services that we're providing to tribes too, or associate members and partners, and through a lot of the grant work that we've got. So we still have connections to some of those other communities. We've been in Quig, just a few weeks before as part of their hazard mitigation planning process. And so we're not disconnected. It's just not formal relationship. Does it make it more challenging that they don't have city government or a borough government? It wouldn't have done anything to prevent the impact of Halong. But I do think a role for a borough government isn't just about taxing in schools, right? It's about regional coordination and bringing people together and having some level of government that's able to do that convening power within a region. And I think it's useful. Otherwise, it does just fall to the state, and then you've got state and individual communities, but nobody really kind of that intermediary between. So I think in some ways, some level of regional government is important. It doesn't have to be a borough. We're going to talk at our annual conference more about councils of government and regional councils, which exist in other states and might be useful ways for cities and tribes and others in a region to come together and have a platform to be cooperating a little bit differently. But those things don't exist right now.
Going into your 8th year,
yeah,
what do you think AML is doing especially well right now? And what do you think AML could be doing better or more of in the future?
Yeah. Ultimately, we're going to have to protect local governments from you. The impacts of a state retreat or federal retreat at some level. I'm really concerned about a state budget where there aren't sufficient revenues to fulfill obligations. That is problematic. And maybe we have a different interpretation of obligations, and not you. Sorry, Representative. But the state, a state that isn't able to be the partner that we need and to make investments in communities that are necessary, and where there's not a tax base to do that, where you're the assembly for an organized borough to support those communities. Like, those are real obligations that do have to be met to some degree. And where that's not in place, that's a big challenge and concern for us as we move forward. So we've been talking more and more about how do we not move communities entirely to self-reliance, but how do we reduce some of those dependencies? So great if the state is able to do its job and more, but when it's not, to insulate communities so that they have the tools they need to do it otherwise. Resident expectations don't go away. So how do we differently resource local governments? How do we make sure they can still meet their obligations under those circumstances?
So say, for example, you had a large city that used to get a significant portion of its operating budget from the state, and it no longer gets it.
Yeah.
And that particular large city, for whatever reason, has never passed a sales tax or income tax. It's just reliant completely on property taxes.
Right.
And that municipality is running out of money. It seems like it's like a...
Just hypothetical municipalities.
Hypothetical.
Yeah.
It seems like that there's a segment of the public that doesn't get it. And it's like, how do you communicate to the public that we have a lot less money now and we're not going to be able to provide the services that you expect without more money? And I guess, does AML get involved at all? No, but you guys do. It's local control. But I also feel like, can you give best practice advice? We've had other communities that have actually been able to pass a sales tax.
Okay.
And this is how they did it.
Yeah. It's not unique to any one municipality. I think every local government struggles with how to balance taxation and level of services consistent with tax base and capacity and burden and resident needs. We just had a tax conference, so I'm not afraid of a tax word. It's not 4 letters for me. It's not always about taxing more. What we have to get better at in Alaska is really knowing what are all the tools and types of taxes that could be put together to be consistent, coherent, and take advantage of lots of different tax bases. I think that's important, and I think it's hard to describe that to folks. So getting tax right and spreading out, diversifying the type of taxes you're using is really important. It captures different types of people's expenditures or assets or whatever. We have been trending toward more diversification of taxes across communities over the last 20 years. So that's good. I think there are important things for the public to know. It might be assumed that we're like other states. And in Alaska, 80% of our tax base is exempt in a lot of ways, whether it's land or federal, state, local, there's so many ways that we have a very limited tax base to work with, which means the taxes that people are experiencing feel like a lot more. They're bearing more of the brunt. And all the exemptions out there pile on to that experience. And every new mandated exemption from the state or new exemption, or carve out for one group or another, they might be benefiting, but everybody else is bearing that burden. So I think that's important to know. And AML, I think, does have a role in talking about really statewide, broadly experience. Here's what's going on in lots of different communities. We're going to start mapping that out a little bit more from a GIS perspective. Here's what's exempt, here's what's not, here's who owns what. And we're going to spend more time on that. We've done research over the last couple of years on the impact of exemptions. And are the exemptions that we designed in the 80s the exemptions that we need today? The senior exemption is one that everybody should know about, right? It means $100 million off the books for local governments, but the needs is just getting shifted to other portions of the population. And I can appreciate that our most vulnerable residents need some level of exemption. Is that everybody? I don't know. But those are the questions that we would want community leaders to be asking. If we want new people or young people or working age people or new housing, Should exemptions be targeted there? How do you prioritize like the package of exemptions that you have? And what kind of limitations then do you have like at the state level to be able to really do that? It's about getting it right for each community and not just like adding on. And I think we haven't done enough of that. I think the other thing that probably the public and a lot of folks are still used to is the state paying for things. And we really haven't turned the corner from the state being in a position to do that. So I think that local governments pick up a lot of what the state used to, and residents don't know that or don't see that. And I think that's a big deal right now, and it's gone underreported. And I think what happens is like local governments have mitigated kind of the consequences of state decision making so that residents don't see it as much, and residents still have the same expectations, but it's a local and not local state anymore kind of partnership in that delivery. So I think we need to talk more about here's how the state decisions are impacting residents and local taxpayers, and here's why. I think there's also work AML could do just to talk about what's the value of municipal services. And I think there's a lot of things that go unknown about the things that they do.
I interviewed Representative Robin Burke, now Robin Freer.
Yeah.
She just got married. Her episode will actually come out after yours. Okay. But she talked about that take for granted thing that on the North Slope, all of their trash is paid for and dumpsters, all of that's free. And so she said a very common response when anybody who grew up there moves somewhere else is, I have to pay for trash. This is absurd, because when it feels normal, you don't appreciate it at all. You just assume that no one pays for trash pickup. And I think that kind of speaks to Alaska in general about so many things that people expect to get without any sacrifice on their part.
Yeah. I think the data shows local taxation in Alaska is basically kept up with inflation, but it doesn't show like how needs have increased and or what that shifting from state to local look like. Mill rates have gone down over the last 20 years. I think that's interesting to see. I think the impact of exemptions is just one of those other, right? So how do we like highlight, here's the things that you don't see in these discussions, and here's why we're having conversations about new and different taxes. Communities that might be reliant right now on property taxes, adding other types of, sales or excise or other types of taxes is just capturing revenue from elsewhere to offset some of that. I mean, Kena added a sales tax and dropped their property tax, and that's what's paying for their schools right now is the sales tax. And so you have to think about what's our economy and where should the tax burden lie. Those are hard and really technical.
Any last thing that you wish people understood about AML or municipalities in Alaska?
I think one of the things that I've loved about my job is just how passionate and excited local leaders are. Like they're just want to do good things in their communities. And it's hard, right? Working with 6 other people to make decisions, and each of your vision is a little bit different. But they're just excited about good things in the community and try to represent community interests. I think local leaders are experiencing things that, they're not always going to tell you about. If costs are going up, they're going to eat it. If the state does this, local governments often suck up more than they should, honestly. But it's all like love of community. And we often talk about local governments being the heart of Alaska. It's that kind of sentiment that I think so many municipal leaders and local governments like bring to the table. So I hope people see that in the hard work that's going on. It might not always translate into the difference that people want to see, but also that takes time, and you can't just expect that happens overnight. Or
I think that, speaking for Anchorage, there's often a lot of demonization of local government, regardless of who's in office. Yeah. The social media take is they're doing a terrible job. No matter what's happening, it's terrible.
Yeah.
And I'm curious if that is a Anchorage phenomenon and other communities are more supportive of their local government, or if it's common for folks to really start and end with a place of criticism for their local government.
No, you're not special. I think It's increasingly common since COVID. We see it much more strained relationship, it seems like. It's also not unique to Alaska. This is the experience across the nation. Dissatisfaction with congressional delegations, with governors, with state legislatures, and local government remains the most trusted. We just actually polled that, and that still remains true. Most trusted, most respected in Alaska. But there are definitely communities in Alaska where they're very challenging assembly or council meetings, and communities that are struggling, residents that feel the pain and want answers. And I get that. And there's not a lot of solutions, right? There's only so much that local governments can do. There is that interdependence with state and federal. And like when you don't have all of that kind of working together to meet residents' needs, it's the local government that's going to bear the brunt of that because they're the ones that are meeting. They're the ones you're going to see the most often. And that's where you're going to take the challenges that you're experiencing.
One last question that I'll ask, and you may not be able to answer it, and I'll have to cut all of this out. But Julie Colomb, representative of the Hillside in Anchorage, when she was on House Finance, she made a very interesting graph of the proportion of capital budgets that went to various parts of Alaska and was showing per capita dollars spent in capital budgets over the past 10 years. And it showed that Anchorage has always gotten far less per capita than Fairbanks, Western Alaska, other parts of Alaska. And I think my impression is from working in the state legislature is that people love to hate Anchorage.
Yeah.
They call it Los Anchorage. They say it's a place that no one wants to live, that no one wants to be.
Yeah.
And I think we don't get our fair share of the state money.
Right.
And I think you can see that now with the budget struggles at the municipal level, with them having to basically cover for this missing $100 million that they had for a long period of time that's no longer there. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if AML is able to recognize disparity and how one particular municipality is demonized and mistreated for having so many people.
Yeah. I think we have a lot of structural issues in Alaska. So much of what you just described is systemic. We haven't finished some of what we meant to at statehood. We don't have organized boroughs everywhere. We don't have systems of public education that are funded at the local level and publicly delivered at the local government level. We still have a lot of dependence on the state for those obligations. So all of that is true. I think, like in terms of does Anchorage get a fair shake? I think we also have to look at like relative need, right? I was just listening to a school superintendent from Cuspuk School District that talked about we've got a school that in the winter you can skate in there and in the summer there's a waterfall. And like that scale of need, that unmet need over decades, institute like failures to and neglect in those regions. I think that's why you see probably outsized capital budgets potentially in regions that are like, we don't have anything. And that's not to say that Anchorage doesn't also need something, but that's probably why. And we haven't solved for those things. We don't have equitable taxation in Alaska. We don't have that at all.
Fran Ulmer, when she was doing an address at the Alaska History Association in 2024, basically talked about whether or not we can afford to have large schools in every corner of this extraordinarily geographically large state that's not well connected. There's no energy infrastructure. How do we pay for heating? How do we pay for upkeep? Right. And this comes up at local level in Anchorage with us closing schools and right-sizing the school district. Yeah. And, when you have less kids, you don't need as many school buildings. And of course, everyone wants to protect their kids' school, right, the school across the street from their house. But, if we have 7,000 less kids in the school district, we inevitably don't need as many buildings.
Yeah.
And I think having that conversation at a state level, and not just about like school buildings, but about lots of our infrastructure.
Right.
I don't know if AML participates in those discussions or encourages those discussions.
Yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time thinking about school construction, major maintenance, where that's at, where it's headed. contribute to the education task force that's out there right now. And ultimately, we want to see the state fulfill that constitutional obligation, and happy to be creative and constructive and re-envisioning what that looks like and how we do it. I think we can't be held to, here's how we've always done it. And so I think that imagining is useful.
I'll just speak for ASD.
Yeah.
We just got briefed on this. They're not shuttering the doors. They're repurposing the use of the building. They're moving a charter school into it. They're creating a preschool program. The buildings are not closing their doors. They're being used, they would say, more efficiently, differently.
But if you start doing that across the state, so like what the outside looking in sees is they're shrinking. Is that the investment I want to make when I move to a new location? We started talking early on about the owner state. Are we getting the right value from all of our resources? Are we translating that value into investments that all of our communities need? I think those kinds of questions are, and I'm not just talking oil, there's all kinds of resources.
I mentioned Representative Robert Freer. Yep. She talks about the North Slope being able to pay for things because most of our subsurface wealth is underneath the North Slope. Interestingly, Michelle Spark talked about, when she was on the podcast, about how most of our wealth is underneath remote Alaska, not underneath the major population centers. Feels like that the people who are being disadvantaged and hurt are the people who are actually living on top of the mineral wealth in some cases.
As long as we remain with a mindset that the resources under the ground are more important than the resources on top of it, like that's going to hold us back. And so I think the investment in people is the measure of success that other countries and states have found. The ability to translate that education into workforce, into innovation, into business development is what has set most other states away from kind of that continued resource development into like new stages of economy. So I do worry about that. I mean, people have talked about intergenerational transfers of wealth, and I can't think of a better one than education. And I think we could do more on that front.
Andreassen, thanks so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akelec.gov or call 907-269-0123.